Hello and welcome to the Young Film Academy podcast, the essential podcast for teenagers looking to find their way into the creative industries. I am Dan Allen. I'm joined by Ellen Thomas. How's it going, Ellen?
Hi, Dan. Yeah, all good over here.
That is very good. Because it's all good over here as well, just so you know. So we are, although we're in the same building, we're just in different rooms because of how we record these. And that way we don't have to look at each other.
In this room.
Yes, no, absolutely. I'm joking. And also we can see each other. We're just on webcam. But yeah, and who are we speaking to today, Ellen?
So today we've got a very exciting guest. Ollie George Clark is joining us. And Ollie is a writer. He writes for book, stage, TV and radio, and the focus of our conversation today is going to be about Ollie's novel, which is called The Youngest Faircrest and the Search for a Sorcerer, which is the first of a series in a sort of fantasy adventure series, and it has just been released. So we're going to get into that today and also kind of talk about the different forms and formats and mediums that Ollie writes in, because in TV, he's currently under commission for 3 new television comedies and dramas, and he's been part of writers' rooms for Heat and Series 3 of Industry, and he's also written a lot of radio plays that have been on the likes of BBC Radio 4 and BBC Radio London. So yeah, lots of exciting things to get into in the world of writing.
Absolutely. So without any further ado, welcome to the podcast, Ollie. How's it going? We'll record our intro and outro afterwards, so we'll just sort of jump into it and stuff. But yeah, so welcome to the podcast, Ollie. How's it going, Ollie?
Thank you so much for having me both. It's lovely to be here. How are you both? I'm very well.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. Very good. We're very excited to chat with you about all things stories and fantasy and everything. And I thought maybe we could sort of just kick off sort of as we were sort of talking about before we started recording, just about obviously your book and fantasy as a genre and how it sort of compares to film. I think there's so much crossover obviously between writing stories for novels or for books versus film, but then there's also so much different. But we were talking specifically about how, like, I suppose young adult books maybe lend themselves slightly more as a crossover with cinema. How have you found the writing comparable between young adult writing and writing for film?
I think you're absolutely right. I think there is an awful lot of crossover. And when I started, I came to novels having first been writing scripts for a very long time. So a lot of my instincts that I had sort of been developing, my writing skills I've been developing that way, had quite an easy crossover. So I write for I think the term is middle grade. So we're sort of like 8 and upwards. And I borrowed when coming from script into that, all the things that you're sort of taught that your scripts need to have in, that you want sort of very pacey scenes and you want very sort of exciting and vibrant dialogue, and you want everything to be rattling along. And the other thing as well that I find really helpful for this age range is that there are certain, not restrictions, but there are certain things that are very helpful when you're writing. So aspects like plot is very, very important, and you want things to be moving at a real sense of momentum. And I think it's the same with script. So I planned this book in many ways like it was a script. The chapters, for example, are very, very short, and no chapter in the book is over 1,000 words. But that, I think, when comparing it to script writing, is because it sort of exists as a scene. There's no chapters where you have a time jump, for example. They are like scenes in the sense of you have a group of people solving something and then you move on. And I think it really lends itself to books in a way, because you do feel like everything is moving at a real lick, which I know is especially when you've written your script and someone is reading it cold. Often I think that's the hardest thing, that you would have a couple of lines of setup, but really you don't know them, they don't know you. The script has to do all the heavy lifting, and you want it to feel like it's a sort of runaway train, don't you?
Yeah, no, for sure. Because I was thinking, like, writing a screenplay to me, because I used to write, I can't say books, chapters when I was younger. I'd maybe get 3 or 4 chapters into a novel, but then I found it really liberating to move to screenplay, where it felt like that's a format that does have artistry, obviously, but a lot of the artistry, as you're saying, is in the plotting, it's in the character. A lot of the writing itself is about being as simple as you can, not simplistic, but just as straightforward, and you just want to just get through what is the information the audience need, and then everything else is sort of superfluous, and you can sort of lose it. But there is more efficiency in that sort of like writing for young and old people. But I guess you're still thinking maybe about like, is it like the way you're writing, and you're still having to use like tools that are specifically for the book and for the novel medium versus the screenplay format? Would you say?
Definitely. I absolutely. I think there's the thing that I strove for with this book in particular, because when I was that age, I wasn't a particularly confident reader. So accessibility was the heart of what I wanted this book to be. And I wanted, no matter how old you were, you would feel confident in picking it up, and that it felt very, very readable. And I think that terms of accessibility factors into everything. So it factors into your character's want, into your world building, into people's dynamics and their relationships, because you're setting yourself, or I was very conscious of setting myself up in, because it's a fantasy world and it's an entirely new world. So we're much more in the sense of Westeros or Middle Earth, in that we've got no touch point to our world. I was very conscious there's an awful lot of exposition you have to get through, and there's a lot of information you have to convey. So you want it to feel as accessible as possible. And like you said, you want it to drip feed through the story as much as possible. You don't want it to be top heavy, that you go, oh, here's everything you need to know, and then I'll tell you the story. And I think there is a succinctness of storytelling that puts you in to a certain mindset, and I think it then is incredibly transferable into scripts, because really the situation you're thinking of, those same situations, how can I convey the story as quickly and as clearly as possible so that people can pick it up and know what's going on. But then also crucially in terms of character, is why it matters and why that character wants it, and what obstacles they're going to face. You're just aligning those in such a way that everyone understands it. And I think, to use I've used Middle Earth as an example, that quest-like structure really works in. So that my the first novel, Youngest Faircrest and the Search for Sorcerer, which is the start of a new series, the first book structure is a quest, and they really lend themselves to fantasy books and fantasy stories more widely, because obviously you can travel through the world and you get to see all the different world building, all the different aspects of this fantasy land. But crucially, what they often do is that want from the character as to why the quest is happening is often very succinct and accessible. So to use the Lord of the Rings example, without spoiling my book, no matter what happens along that story and all the different characters we meet and all the different towns we go to, the whole reason we're doing this is they have to destroy the ring. Everything is. And I think that gives a real clarity to it, so that you're able to have much more complicated and nuanced encounters with elves or being kidnapped by spies or whatever it is. But at no point you any doubt as to why any of this is happening. And that speaks to both the writing point of view and the audience point of view. Like, well, yeah, of course you've got to do that, because you have to destroy the ring. And that gives a real, also speaking more widely, it gives your story a spine that, when you're going into an entirely new world, you do need a definitive beginning and an end. And I think setting up your end as clearly and as well as those sort of stories do with a quest structure, you go, well, I'll know if I do it. I know if I'll complete the quest. And also you then have a more interesting question in terms of that want of a quest is, does your lead character get what they want, or do they get what they need? And then I think you can have a more sort of rounded journey with your hero along, so you can sort of deepen and make them more complicated.
It sort of allows for more freedom. Like there's a touch point and like a core, but the characters can sort of stray more into sort of more interesting and like complicated avenues, and always return to this one thing that's kind of guiding the story.
I think the example I always use as well, to leave Lord of the Rings to one side, is Shrek. In that Shrek's want at the start is that he wants everyone to leave his swamp, and that's his reason for going to do all this stuff. And the thing I think that is so well done in the sort of simultaneous accessibility of that, understanding that what he wants it, he wants to be alone. But the complexity of the character as you go along, he doesn't really want to be alone. He doesn't want anyone to be at his swamp because he's sort of rejecting them before they reject him in many ways, because everybody feels what he wants is friends and company. And I think that journey from starting off, I want my swamp to be alone, and by the end, actually, I need people with me. I need the Fiona and the donkey. That journey, I think, is so well done and so well mapped, and the change of that character, I think, is really profound, whilst keeping all those elements of really clear and accessible storytelling. Which again, that's writing for a younger audience, but it's the bones of that and the planning of that is no more or less. There's no more or less steps than looking at Kendall Roy in Succession. I think you're still asking yourselves the same questions of what do they want, what do they need, where are we going? It all still works. I think there's a huge amount of crossover between those two mediums.
I also wanted to ask. I want to speak some more about like the fantasy genre, but I also wanted to ask before we move on about interiority, because I think that's always such a big question when it comes from moving between like screen and prose or novels. Like, how did you find that sort of having access to your character's thoughts and emotions when writing, which is something that you don't have in the same way in screen? I mean, what was that like going between?
That's a good question. I think to help answer that, I think that the structure of my fantasy novel is, as I say, we're in a complete fantasy world, and the hero is called Youngest Faircrest, and he is our hero. And we start, as many of these this age range do. He's 12 years old and he's heading towards a big event, and often what is the case was I thought, well, I can either go first person for this story and I'm in his head. But then the thing I really wanted to do was find a workaround for explaining the wider world. And so I borrowed what I think it was a very popular way of telling children's stories, especially I think in the sort of 50s and 60s. And I'm not comparing my book to this book, but I always remembered at school studying To Kill a Mockingbird, and the opening line being, and I'm paraphrasing, something along the lines of, "It was the summer that Scout broke her arm." And there is an element, you're instantly setting up a structure there of, okay, well, you're all adults now, and you're looking back on this, so you've got a degree of separation from it. And also you're looking back on the reason for that story existing is that clearly this was a formative event. And I really liked that, and I thought that could really work in the fantasy world, because I can use that structure as a way to tell the readers everything about the world. And so while Youngest Faircrest is the hero, all the books are told from the perspective of Agnes Witterer, who is his best friend, who is remembering their adventures as children. And what that opens me up, that opens up two different avenues. And on the one hand, Agnes doesn't have the burden of being the hero. And what that allows you is it's an easier story to tell in that she is observing his journey as opposed to the first person I am experiencing the journey. And that is two-pronged. One, in the sense of she's obviously watching it at the time, but then she's reflecting on it in hindsight. So those two things I think were battling at the same time. And what that allows me then is you get the immediacy of the present, in the sense of everything is happening now. As I was saying, I was really conscious of pace and momentum. Everything is unfolding in real time, as it were. But you have the benefit of hindsight. So there are also moments of simultaneous reaction and reflection. And those two things coexisting, I think, allows for a much clearer way to tell the story. And I think as it sort of is unfolding, because as I say, it's all new and it's all fancy, and there's new fancy creatures and there's new worlds and towns and how they work, you're able to simultaneously be in it and amongst it as if you're there. But Agnes is able to comment upon it for someone who isn't there, which of course is everyone reading it. And I think that from the world building point of view, from the world point of view, that's really beneficial. But in terms of Youngest's own insights and internal monologue, as the lead and how he's feeling, Agnes can sort of dip in and out of that. And we didn't want too much of, thought Youngest, because you sort of, it removes what is your structure, and you go, well, Agnes wouldn't know what he was thinking. But what she can do is talk to him and he can relay how he's feeling. So almost that internal monologue becomes hopefully more interesting, because you have to put it through the structure of dialogue. And I think all those sorts of things of what you say and how you say it can then hint towards how you're feeling. The benefit of having a sort of structure where your narrator is not the hero of the story really does help, I think, in terms of pace, especially. But you do the arc that you are writing and the arc that you're creating for your readers is also then very different, and I think it really lends itself to hopefully what it feels very fresh and very different. And equally speaking to that accessibility point of view, there's something I hope that is very, very engaging in the fact that the narrator is talking to you and is going, oh, I want to tell you this story. And we have these chapters in the book which are called mini chapters in main chapters, where Agnes has forgotten something, and we have a break in the text, and the whole format changes, and it affords you a playfulness, I think, in a way that being first person, having your narrator experience everything firsthand, you're constantly responding to stimulus, and also as well, I think it allows a ability, like I was saying, there's a degree of reflection you can have with your narrator, and Agnes can offer comment on youngest actions. And also one of the things that I find really exciting as well is that you can have your narrator can comment almost critically on the hero's actions, and there's a point in the story where, as I say, this is a quest structure, that they get lost, and there's something I think quite fun, certainly for me, but also dramatically for Agnes, who is unrated, to go, oh, youngest, this is completely wrong, we've gone the wrong way. And I think because you don't have that, as I say, you're not with the hero the whole time, and you're following a different sort of journey alongside the story and creating it that way, you're allowed much more sort of exciting beats, I hope, and it gives the whole book a real sense of, as I say, not only ease of storytelling, but an accessibility into it, that you can pick it up and go, okay, well, I'm being told this story. And it also borrows as well, which so many fantasies do, is that sort of structure of once upon a time, that you were so used to being told stories. It's quite nice to then borrow an element of that and say, oh, I want to tell you something that's very...
What's sort of your process in terms of like with the world building? Because you know, when you like, if you spend so much time imagining it in your head and drawing out the world, are you ever faced with this conundrum of like forgetting what you have and what you haven't explained yet in the book? Do you know what I mean? Because you've got all the blanks filled out in your head, but sort of trying to remember what you've told the audience at any one point, they might not
absolutely
have
and I think the trouble almost with fantasy is that you can go down such rabbit holes in your own sort of things. You're going, oh, well, this aspect was here. So the way that I did it, and it actually is a trick borrowed from script writing, is I was constantly writing this story under the guise of that this lead hero, protagonist and main character, needs to be in the worst position possible at all times. And so rather than builds this entire world, and the island is called Revel, I should say, and all the towns are named sort of where they are geographically. So you've got Cliff Edge on the east, and you've got Mountaintop in the north, and we're in Bogsnosh, which is a town built around the bog, sort of in the centre. And rather than create that world and then go, okay, well, whose story am I telling in this? I started with youngest Faircrest as this hero, and I was sort of drawing him. The first line of the book I ever wrote, which is the purest form of inspiration I've ever had in any of my writing, is I was sat thinking about what to do and struggling to find an idea, and I was looking at that sort of horrendous blank page on the laptop, thinking, what can I do now? And out of nowhere wrote youngest Faircrest was the youngest of the Faircrest children, and I don't know where it came from, but there is something so grounding in that description of that character, in so much as it asks a lot of questions, and that he is the youngest of how many, who are the Faircrests, and also as well character-wise, being the youngest of the fact, it puts your character at a certain point, and you're really grounding them amongst the wider world. So I drew youngest as this hero. I wanted him to feel not like your typical hero. So he's a very, like I say in the prologue to the book, he's a very anxious and nervous and uncertain boy. And I thought, well, with that ethos of thinking, how can I put him in the worst position possible? that is always at the forefront of my mind. And also, just to give context as well, I was writing a few months previously. I had been on writing commission with a theatre, and I was talking to the artistic director about what they were doing next and what they were looking for next. And she said, "Oh, as it happens, I'm writing a competition for I'm judging a competition for young playwrights." And I said, "Oh, well, fascinating. How is that going?" And she said, "Well, strangely, it's a nationwide competition. It's 14 and down, and they can write whatever they can write under whatever remit they want. They just have to write the most dramatic thing they can think of." And interestingly, sort of 60 to 70% of them have all written about the same thing. And I said, "Oh, that's bizarre. What have they written about?" And it was all some form of, it was either a phone call they had to pick up, or a doorway they had to walk through, or an event they had to attend, or a conversation they had to have. For whatever reason, in that age group, obligation was the most dramatic thing they could think of. There was something about having to do something they don't want to do. And I sort of thought about it for a long time, thinking, is that because at that sort of age, your school results are mattering a lot more, and you're starting to pick, you're thinking about your career, or that puberty's around the corner. There's a lot of obligations that are coming at you. And that really stuck with me as a general feeling for that age group. And I sort of twinned that then with youngest Faircrest. And I created this structure, which is called the deciding.
Yeah.
And at the deciding, which happens in Bogsmarsh, at 12 years old, everyone leaves school, and you go for your meeting with the decider, who is the town leader and lawmaker. And they look at your school results and aptitude and your history and how you performed, and they determine which profession you are best suited for. And there's the coveted ones, which are things like guardians and preacherologists, where you study to be warriors or go and try and document and befriend all the fantastical animals on the island. Crucially, there is one called dearth, and dearth is where you have no obvious skill and you just have to watch the Bogsmarsh pigs all day. And when you're creating that thing of like, well, what's the worst thing that can happen to youngest? You think, okay, well, he could have to do at 12 years old. If he's the youngest and he's got 5 siblings above him, it's his day of deciding. And that would, I think, for him, feel the worst thing imaginable. And then what that does is suddenly it gives you a structure. And you go, okay, well then, if you've got this town of Bogsmarsh and you've got the deciding, and what I then do is you ask yourself lots of questions in the sense of, well, if we have a decider, how many other deciders have we had? Why did we start having deciders? How do they get? And all that world building comes from that. And also, like, similarly with an event like the deciding, is you go, okay, well, what 12 professions do you have, and which is the most coveted and which is the one people don't want? So your world building sort of naturally flows from that point. But crucially, it all comes from character. And also as well, just on the topic of screenwriting, what I think is really important as well in those sorts of stories, which is obligation led or some sort of event led, I would say, is you have to find a way, as I did, to keep your character in front of that sort of stuff, because otherwise you have a passive lead. You need some form of way to keep your character making decisions. And the example I always was working on was the Hunger Games, in that is an event sort of based story that is going to happen regardless. And the thing that Suzanne Collins does really well in those books and the subsequent films is that Prim, Katniss's sister, is the one chosen. And by Katniss volunteering, that being the inciting incident, it tells us an awful lot about her as a lead character. But crucially, her action and her agency gets in front of what is obligation and is an immovable object. And it keeps your protagonist therefore making decisions and therefore in front of everything that happens. Because the risk is with these sorts of stories is that your lead character is then just a pebble in a stream, and what you actually need is you need your hero to be making, because like as we know sort of your character is defined by their actions, so you're trying to give them opportunities to help their own definition. So that's where so the world building for youngest came exactly from those two things, and thinking, who is this character and what do they want and what are they crucially is the worst thing for them, and how can we build out from that? And then secondly, how do I give them agency within that structure?
That's so interesting. I think, because I think that applies to whether it's fantasy or not. I think that, which is so cool about that. And then I kind of wanted to know, like, when you're doing that world building in this fantasy context, starting with character, and then you have so much freedom for the worst thing to happen to them it can be anything. It's like, how do you guide that process in the fantasy context? Yeah.
No, absolutely. I think, yeah, you're absolutely right. I think that situation of trying to establish what actions can your character take to define them is every form of storytelling. It's absolutely not exactly not just fantasy. It's the hurdle that you're making in every story you start is thinking, well, how can I give my hero an opportunity to define themselves in some way? And I think with the world building of the fantasy world and how it can become so big, I think keeping that focus on what the story is that you're telling, I think is the most important thing there, because like you say, you can lose yourself in currencies and dragon scales, and suddenly you're going, oh, none of this is really relevant. And which I think what might be helpful is the first draft of this book was, I mean, unbelievably, it was over 100,000 words. And over the course of editing it with my agents and then subsequently publisher, we're now at about sort of 53,000 words. So we've lost half of what we started with. But that also comes down to finding your sort of trying to get with a sort of needlepoint accuracy. Well, firstly, what is the story? And also making sure that the events that happen, so that because this is a quest structure, inevitably you're running into stuff. You're running into obstacles, you're running into hurdles or whatever it is, that you're thinking, well, what does each one offer as an opportunity to develop your characters? So that is what gives you that real focus, I think. So it's not a case of we're just, as was in the first draft, where we're running into this group of creatures because it took me ages to think of them and they're really cool and I want to show off. Okay, well, actually, you don't need any of them. What you need is to give youngest an opportunity to prove how heroic he is, or to prove that he can do this, or you're looking for an opportunity for Agnes to display her character and ability. So really what helps me keep that focus in all forms of storytelling really is you're constantly just asking yourself, like we do in every scene, what has changed, what have we learnt, and why do we care, are always those questions that are in every block of everything you write. Because otherwise I think that's what I think sometimes if you're reading a book, you're watching a film, or you're watching a TV show, whatever it is, often I think that can be the first sort of thing as to why you become detached from it, because you go, I don't know why I'm watching this, I don't know what relevance this has. And I'm a real big advocate of killing your darlings as well, and that just getting to the point as quickly as possible. And it's that thing I learned in script writing that I borrowed in the book is, start a scene halfway in and get out before it ends. You just want to keep moving. And like I say, Agnes as our narrator really helps that, because she can keep the plot rattling along because it's so conversational. And she's telling you, like, when we were camping, we were doing this, or then we ran into this, or whatever it is. But also having the other bit that really helps me is I like a really taut time frame in that it helps for an accessibility point of view, because at no point are you lost. There's no time jump, so you don't know. Well, you have no time to ask yourself any questions. I think there's a real thing that I like, that everything feels like this event happens. And I think the youngest book is set over about 3 or 4 days. So you start on the day the youngest deciding, and you end 3 days later, and everything is a moment to moment domino effect. And I also think that helps with keeping readers engaged and turning the page, is that you do want to know what happens next, and ending chapters on cliffhangers that I try and do for every chapter. And as I was saying before, no chapters over 1,000 words, so there's a real speed to it anyway. So I think all those things keep you confined to what you want to do. I think knowing the story you're telling and making sure it's as plotted as possible helps that hugely, because you're absolutely, you can lose yourself in.
What was it like cutting it in half?
It is a lot.
Was that a difficult process for you, or were you kind of just emotional? Yeah, or were you just kind of chainsawing your way through it?
I'm a big believer in. I'm a big believer in that. I really trust in that brevity is the thing you want. So even at 100,000 words, I thought this feels, even for a fantasy novel, this feels long. I mean, that is for my readership, that's way too long a book anyway. So I was more than happy to start cutting it. But also, I think what's really beneficial is as you start sort of looking at it more objectively, because that first draft, like with all writing, you look at it and it's just every idea you've ever had in relation to the story, and it's only with a bit of distance that you can start to see actually what it was that you were trying to do. So I think then coming into it and thinking, okay, what can we lose, was actually the most fun bit. And like such as the saying is that writing is rewriting, and I think it's true in that you only really then going, okay, well, what's the sharpest version of that? And because the book is also hopefully very, very funny, you'll then go, okay, what's a better joke than that? How can we get that point quicker? And you can feel, I think, as writers, you can really sense it when the story is starting to tick along and work better. And often it's because you're losing a lot of other stuff that you don't need, or alternatively, it's looking at things in a different way, or finding if there's something about a character you really want to go into, or there's something, a story element that you really want to explore, it's finding a way to do it in such a way that feels fresh and different and bouncy, and humor is always a really good one for that. I remember I always stayed with it was years ago, but I was watching an interview with J.J. Abrams talk about Star Trek Into Darkness, and one of his interviewers said the story goes so fast, like that film is non-stop, and Jacob said, oh yeah, it is. And he said, why is it so fast? And he said something to the effect of, because the more you think about it, the more it doesn't make sense. And I think that you do have that real, like, at any point there, if you stop for a second to go, hang on, let's think about this, you might do something differently. But I think the propulsion of these sorts of stories really help it, and having your characters in a situation that they have to make a decision quickly. One, I think it's much more fun to read or watch it, but also it creates a more dynamic form of storytelling. And I think he's right when he says it doesn't make any sense. As in, yeah, I suppose there is a version of that where you sit back at every twist and go, okay, well, let's reflect and think of the best thing. But it's much more exciting to go, no, we're going now, and suddenly you're all running for a spaceship. So I think those sorts of things are also really beneficial. But again, I think that speaks to more than that. That speaks to a thing that as writers we always have to be conscious of, which is the stakes and why things matter, and putting your story in a sort of almost kiln-like environment that everything feels very, very pressured, that the characters are in a position where they keep needing to make decisions that feel in that sort of point of high drama. They get, okay, we've got to do this and we've got to keep going, and all those sorts of questions I think are real hurdles. But the editing process, when you're losing half that book, really is when you can start to ask them, because you then can see the broad shape of what it is that you've got, and you're going, okay, well, what's the better version of that? What's the more pressured opportunity I can put the characters in? Or what's the more dynamic way to look at this? That's all those different elements for me when we were doing that. And also as well, I'm a firm believer in that nothing's ever really lost, in the sense of it might have improved your writing, or it might have sharpened your dialogue. And even if my laptop is filled with stories that will never see the light of day, that I was sure at the time were going to win Oscars. So, but I think you learn something new from every single one, and every single thing that doesn't quite find its home, but you take an element that you, or a really silly example, almost because it was quite early on, but I wrote this play, it was topical with the Odyssey out, but I wrote this play about the Trojan War, and it was this huge, sprawling, unproducible 3-hour play with 30 characters. And the trouble with that, there were so many characters without exaggeration, with about 6 pages to go, characters were still introducing themselves to each other. The audience would have met and watched them introduce people 4 times by this point. And reading it back, you go, oh, I see. It's actually really helpful if you start your story in such a way that everyone knows each other, or you have some degree of connection already. You're not just doing these sort of massive epics where you're going, yeah, we know who that, we've watched them be introduced 5 times already. And that's the lesson I always really remember from that. And I've always thought, well, I suppose that's why stories around families or communities are always committed, because there's already inbuilt relationships. The hard thing with that was
sort of the Shakespearean quality, isn't it?
Yes.
Where it's like, if you make even the villain know the main character, then you get built-in stakes and built-in conflict there, which they even did in Star Wars, turning Darth Vader into the father is like a shortcut to make that more emotional and more dramatic.
Spoiler.
It's exactly that. I'm using
I'm joking. Yeah.
Spoilers for Star Wars. But there's what it does, I think, with that line is it massively complicates that relationship, and it turns what is a very easy villain almost, in terms of like, yeah, they're really bad and awful, and then there's a new dimension. The other example I always think is it's in The Lion King with Scar, and he's awful all that whole film, and plotting and Machiavellian, and then at the very end when Simba's about to kill him, he says, are you really gonna kill your uncle? And that's the moment that Simba pauses, and it's exactly those sorts of things that you go, just to give a moment of like, oh, it's not as easy as that. Having those inbuilt dynamics really help.
The Lion King is based on Shakespeare.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
And having those, like, exactly. And so with that, terrible Trojan play I wrote, but what I've always remembered carrying it forward now is I was like, okay, what's everyone's relation? I was very much destroyed, but I was like, what is everyone's relation to each other? How do they feel about each other? And that's not necessarily something I am starting with, because I'm not a big one for having a huge map of everything's going to happen. But I think it is beneficial if there is an organic way for people to run into each other and they have a pre-existing relationship. And you can define that as you come to it. But I think that having it be totally new for more than half of your cast of characters is difficult, because you are going to have to dodge a lot of introductions.
I was just asking about whether sort of you had to remind yourself when you're writing a book that budget is less of a constraint. So did you feel like you could take your stories to more places, have more creatures, more locations than you would in your film stuff?
Absolutely. I think I started out writing theatre, and the budget angle was such a, not constraint, because I'm also quite a fan of restriction being another invention, but you were very conscious that it needed to be with 3 people, ideally in one room, and that was your play. So for a long time, that was just sort of the way I wrote. And then in the transition, especially to script writing, when you then go, oh my gosh, you can, and it sounds really silly, and I always feel silly when I say it, yeah, oh my gosh, you can have scenes and you can have characters in different places. And you're suddenly all these elements that I felt like I had all these new elements of storytelling at my disposal. And I think with novels, exactly that, especially fantasy novels, your scope is as big and as broad as you can conjure it yourself. And really the biggest thing in terms of thinking about it in that way is how well you can convey it to a reader, and making sure that they can feel all the things that you were excited by, and keeping it going along the way that is, like we've been saying, accessible and understandable, but also links to story or character, but having it also enjoy a real breadth and scope that all these worlds have, and you want it to feel big. One of the discussions we had when we were looking at how to design the map of Ravel is all those sorts of questions. You really do hope one day being asked as a fantasy writer, how long does it take to get from there to there if you're walking, and how long does it take on horseback, and all these sorts of things that you think about in really practical terms, because when you're piecing the story together. So exactly that way, you have such scope. And again, it's like we were saying with the editing process, your hardest bit is keeping yourself restricted and restrained to the story that you're telling, but also making sure it is interesting. And by interesting, what I mean is you can convey it to a reader in a way that they will find it fascinating and interesting. And there's an old draft that I spent ages writing about this sort of event that had happened in the mountain regions on this island, and and it was really sort of convoluted, but I was much more excited in sort of the history of it, and it read like a history book almost. It doesn't affect anyone now, and no one has any emotion. It was so long. So actually all those elements that past fun, I ended up binning just because you're like, well, actually it needs to matter either in the present or emotionally and prove something. So yeah,
you could create an appendices. You could create like an accompanying book. That's just lore.
And people would love that as well.
Yeah. Well, also, like nothing is ever lost. But one of the aspects of this sort of 100,000 word version of the book, a couple of those sort of story beats are very much on my laptop in a folder. I think it's just called other stuff. Well, if ever you need an element of these stories as well, because I'm writing the second one at the moment, that you go, well, okay, is there room for that part of the story that was in there originally? Is there, can that find its way? And so in a really lovely way. I think nothing's ever lost, and it only ever sharpens your writing. So yeah, maybe hopefully it will find it light of day somehow.
And you also do some radio writing as well. Is that correct? Is that like radio plays, or kind of what kind of radio writing are you doing? And I guess how does that as well differ from like novel writing, theatre writing, screenwriting?
Yes, I've written for Radio 4 before, and there's a real. I actually think that was one of the most informative things on my script writing in particular, because obviously it being audio only, you need to find action that that your characters are doing that hints at where they are without it being overt, obviously. So things like cooking is always very good, because you can have lots of sounds going on, and that can help place your characters as well. So you're constantly looking for opportunities of scene settings that lend themselves to audio. And I think that really helps, again, in terms of your structure of your story. And you go, how can I convey where this is succinctly, and what that does, not necessarily because it might be very specific audio plays in terms of it being audio only, but in terms of understanding relationships with characters and where you place scenes. I think that's really important. In that, obviously, a scene set in a bedroom is a completely different tone from one set in a pub. So you're thinking about it in those sorts of terms, in that you're going, okay, well, I need a scene set in a bedroom. How are we going to establish that? But the thing that I found most beneficial, that I've borrowed from radio plays, as I say, most into script writing, is scene transitions. Because you obviously can't say, someone can't come on and go, okay, that scene ended, this is the new one now, and then it's started. You need some form of moment that really links to both, and finding those moments I really, really enjoy. So the context for the radio play with Radio 4 was that it was a couple of actors who were out of work and looking to find a job, and they had this idea to make a fake true crime podcast to see if it could sort of go viral. And they pretended that one of them was descended from a famous but unknown serial killer from the Victorian era, and it had been discovered when they were going through some family heirlooms. Anyway, so one of the things we did for this scene transition is that part of the story is told with the actors creating it and finding the idea, and ultimately the progression of that gets as it becomes in the story, and actual episodes of the podcast, because it's really, because you want the audience to understand what it is that they're having. So that all set up. There's a scene when they're cooking dinner. It's a couple that makes podcasts together, and one of them is chopping onions, and he slips and cuts his finger, and the slice of the knife is a very neat cut into then a slice of the knife in the audio of the podcast. So you can switch very quickly on the same beat. And what that has helped me with script writing is having those visual markers then move you from scene to scene. Not only does it help visually, because I think it's quite cool. I always think Edgar Wright does them really well, but it just helps you make the story feel that it's all one thread. And so I've just finished a script, and a really small thing of a character got out in a panic and slammed their car door. And then the next scene is a totally different character in a totally different place, slamming their car door, and then you move with them. And I think hopefully when you see it visually, it'll feel very, very slick, and from an audience point of view, it all feels as though it's sort of humbling. And that's really beneficial as well for this particular story, but more generally for scenes that are happening at the same time. I think that's a really good indicator that you're basically sort of saying meanwhile. And I think for that was the biggest thing I've learned for radio plays. And when writing a radio play, I developed a real enjoyment of trying to find what are those moments that will work in this story for those scene transitions. And I do exactly the same now with all my scripts, is go, okay, well, if that's how we're ending, what's an action that someone can do that can be mirrored or can be juxtaposed in some way by a totally different character? And it all feels very, very slick. And I was saying this is what I was trying to do to my agent the other day, and I'm sure he said it's called ins and outs, or some sort of term like that, but it's a thing that you're trying to do. But that was really the most beneficial thing I learned, because it's something I've become so conscious of, and really is rooted in that the audio space, because you can't as easily move scenes and things, and there's only so many times you can start having like bird noise to me the next day. So you do need other ways to think of things, but definitely I think that. And also the other big one, I suppose, is dialogue. I love writing dialogue more generally. It's by far and away my favorite part of any form of writing, and the joy really of radio plays is that it's entirely dialogue, and having that be your focus, and a real succinctness on the amount of time you have, as in you've got 44 pages, absolutely no more, no less. And I think that is very beneficial when you're structuring your story, and then when you're coming to write your dialogue, that you're trying to do so many different things at once. You're trying to move the plot along and also deepen characters' relationships and warm you to them and all those elements. So all the hurdles that you have normally with writing dialogue, I felt were magnified in a radio play, because really it's all you've got. You've only got audio.
Do you have to, like, with that, in terms of being exactly 44 pages, to me that sounds like quite a challenge, because if you undershoot the story in a way, then you don't want to feel like you're left with padding, but you need to stretch it and contract it in some ways. But then if you add in another plot thread, does that then make it too long? Like, how do you go about building a story that fits that exact prescriptive amount of pages?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's a lot of planning and a lot of structure in that you're trying to give yourself moments that you really, really need all the way through. And the original draft I did was a few pages too long, and some of the things that we cut were inevitably it's the sort of more comedic moments, because they're not necessary for the plot, and if you're trying to save time, those tend to be the sort of first things that goes. But I think in terms of my structuring of it, I just made sure that all the pillars, by which I mean the defined moments of change that happen along the way, had enough room to feel simultaneously organic and believable. And I think having that, establishing those sorts of spaces was the most important thing. And having that follow a very sort of the structure that the radio play followed was actually Macbeth, but rather than like trying to become a king, they're trying to make a podcast. And so I sort of had a vague outline of where that was going, but all those parts of it that you're trying to convey in terms of, exactly as I said, those columns to be defined. And like we were saying previously with fantasy writing, making sure everything is doing something for character or plot, ideally both. And if it's doing neither, it absolutely has to go.
It's interesting that you said about how comedy or the humor in it was like the first thing to be cut, and then also when you said about the kind of premise being Macbeth but making a podcast, and that kind of inherent concept made me laugh. And it's like, I think everything these days has to have an element of humor in and has to be funny. So it's kind of like, how do you make humor not just like excess if it's the thing that's going to be cut to save time? And how do you kind of bake humor and comedy into your writing? And is that something you even need to do? Like,
No, I completely. Yes. And when I say the humour is the first to go, that is true. But what I mean is sort of just jokes, as it were.
Like jokes. Yeah.
You want the humour of all their interactions and their relationships to stay. So I think my instinct for every story that I'm telling is exactly as you said, it's finding what sort of the funny is in it, or how they are warm and believable. Because in every sort of, I always think with Succession that is not an obviously funny show with its setup, but they are so caustic to one another and they're so funny to one another that I think what that does is a huge amount for all their relationships and all their dynamics and their feelings towards one another. So I think finding ways to bake it into the stakes or their dynamics, it goes back to what we were saying about knowing each other. The fact they're all siblings, they have so many in-jokes and so much history that we are just joining at a certain point and playing catch-up, which is also a really fun point to be, I think, as well for the audience. So my instinct with all the stories I tell is finding funny roots in, and it's not sort of, when I'd say funny, not that it's necessarily a comedy like we'd have with a sitcom, but you're just finding funny opportunities for characters to showcase themselves in a way that feels different, or in a way that their relationship feels like something we're not used to. So it's not that they themselves are telling jokes, it's more that they are just amusing to observe. And I think finding those moments is what really not only helps you, I don't want to say root for characters, but you connect with characters. I watched recently, for example, Widow's Bay. Have you seen that on Apple?
No, I really want to. It's like a horror series, isn't it?
Yeah, it's fantastic. Yeah, it's a horror comedy, and there's how they manage to balance that, I think, it is incredible. And the humor is what I think, because I'm a horror fan, and it is really scary. But I think, to my low bar, it's very scary. But
no, I don't do horror. I don't do horror either.
I think it's a team. But there's the comedy in it, I think, is what allows, from my perspective, that allows for that inroad, and the fact that the lead character Tom is so funny, and all his relationships are so funny. You believe in them so much more as characters, and I think having lots of characters that are very serious, and that it's very dramatic, and that very talking to each other with real sort of agency the whole time, isn't necessarily the most naturalistic, and actually having funny interactions and funny movements and allowing opportunity for those sorts of things. And also as well, I think from a not selling it but point of view, but like we were saying earlier, hopefully the time will come where someone working in development, or an agent, or a producer, whoever it is going to read that script cold, and whether they are reading it at 9 o'clock in the morning and they've had the best night's sleep of their lives, and they've got a fantastic cup of coffee beside them, and they open the page, it needs to work for them as it does the 14th script they've read that day when they're exhausted. All those elements, and you're not going to be there to try and convince them. So this is why it really works. So the comedy, I find, or putting a humorous beat in it, allows it to be a more enjoyable read as someone detached from themselves is going to read it. And also as well, the hardest thing I think to convey in any script is tone, and having, I always call them the stage directions, because I've started in theatre. I don't know if they're called stage directions, but the stage directions of your script, having those convey the tone. So if there's a sort of comedic sensibility or script in your script, they should ideally convey that as well, and that every single word on the page, and that's whether it's a novel or whether it's a script, is helping to convey your tone and your world. And you want those beats, I think, to feel really funny, so that the person reading it goes, oh, I get it, I understand this world. This world is set here, and it helps convey it, I think.
Yeah, for sure. Obviously, with sort of these different mediums, I wondered if you could give us a sense of how long they all take. So I know you mentioned that you were obviously editing your novel for a while. Like, how long did it take to write versus edit the novel, versus writing like a radio play versus writing for TV? Do they all take similar amounts of time, or what?
Yeah, I think it's a very varied. As you know, it's very varied from one to one. But what is the consistent thing is that I'm like to set myself targets for whatever the genre is, or whatever the story is. I give myself a daily target, and I think what that does is that I feel like I'm progressing. So like with a novel where you've got a whole story and you've got tens of thousands of words, I like to do so. I'll do each one in turn. So with novel writing, as I say, each chapter in this youngest series is 1,000 words or less. So I will write 1,000 words every day that I'm writing the book. And what that in practical terms means then is I'm doing a chapter a day. So it means that I'm moving the story forward each time. We're in a new location every time we start. There's no sort of, I'm picking up the scene halfway through. It's a totally new blank slate every morning. And I'm really strict on that 1,000 words, in the sense of, if it's proving really difficult that day, is that you have to just keep going until you hit 1,000 words. Or conversely, if you fly through it because you know where you're going and it takes an hour and a half, I will stop at 1,000 words, because you want to keep that momentum going. So it's not that I will seize on a particularly good day and go, okay, I'll do tomorrow's chapter today. That structure really helps me. And also what it does even in a sort of really shaky broad term, is I can then put a date in my diary and go, I should have a first draft by that point. And that I find really satisfying, in that there's something really attainable, I think, in a way that you go, okay, if I do this, I will have a product at the end of it. Because obviously so much of writing is really difficult, in that, like, it's on your laptop or it's in your head, or it's quite an insular and individual thing. Whereas the thing I like, the aspect of that structure that I really like, is I go, if I can stick to this, I will have a product at the end of it. And it's awful to call it, I don't mean a product in that sort of way, but like, I will have something that I can go, the end, and I can start editing it. With scripts, it's much the same. So I finished my first film script recently, which I just wrote on spec for an idea I've had for a long time, and that was quite heavily planned. Again, I knew where it was going, so I set myself the target of 5 pages a day, and that's almost a bit easier, I think, than the novel, because obviously so much of it is dialogue, and especially if you've, as I do, I had a real sense of what scene to scene was going to happen. So I will do 5 pages every day, and again, it allows you. So this script, I was at pains for it to feel really light on its feet and really quick and to fly through. So I was like, right, it can't be more than 90 pages, and it is 89 pages. So the fact that I was then able to go, okay, well, in sort of however many days, I should have script, and that is harder, because I think you're doing a bigger, well, it's the same sort of story, but the pages are less, and the amount you're conveying is less, so it's harder to get to those 5 pages sometimes. And I always do it, so it's not like it's really rigid. But that, I think, is beneficial. And it's the same when I'm writing film or a TV script, or if I'm doing, say, like a one-pager where I'm making for those that may not know, a sort of, I mean, they're never one page, but one-pager that conveys the show in that sort of way. I will try and do that in a day. And I mean, they're only sort of a page and a half, but the skill of those is somehow finding a way that you pick it up and it feels simultaneously fresh, but also like there are clear comps for where you can see it landing, and also that you've got enough story to go, oh, I see how all of this, there's enough story there for 6 episodes, but not so much that you feel really confused. That is such a skill that I'm still trying to get better and better at. So those I will give myself a day if I can, and go, okay, what are your key points that you're trying to convey? And often I found recently that the novel writing side of my career that is probably the most recent, the fact those books are written to be as in a conversational style has hugely helped my pitching, because I now write it in a conversational style, and I write it that I'm talking to someone, and I think it helps convey all those elements that I want conveyed. But also I think it really helps with it feeling easy to pick up and read, and it can have more natural flow to it. So that is how I've operated. The more writers I speak to, the more I gather that sort of slightly rigid structure is the less common version. But for me, it helps give a real structure to my day. And also, I should stress as well that this is normally, I'm normally only writing at a point where I've got a pretty solid plan. Very rarely am I sitting down and going, well, what happens next? Like I know what is going to happen next by this point. And the planning of it takes as long as it takes, which is only really glib. Like, you have to sit with it and you have to mull on it and go, okay, well, what's that thing? And like with but sometimes you feel that I planned this film, and it wasn't until about the 4th, 5th edit that I realised the reason this scene wasn't working is that the character was doing something that I needed them to do, or the plot needed them to do, as opposed to what felt organic. Although then the scene goes in a slightly different direction, the whole thing feels lighter, because you're not trying to force this pre-built structure on that I've done when I've not been writing. So I think having, this feels like a really silly answer, but having a mix of quite a structured routine, but also giving yourself that flexibility to go, okay, well, it might not align in the way you sort of told yourself, and that is absolutely okay. And as you sort of find your characters, by which I mean you get used to writing in their cadence, and you get used to thinking about what they want, making sure that from an audience's point of view, I suppose, that want feels really understandable. And that sometimes can only come through having written 85 pages of a script, and you go, okay, well, that plan didn't work, but it's okay because we've got a better version now.
This sort of structured approach that you describe, is that something you've always had, or you've had to kind of learn from writing professionally? Like, have you sort of always worked in that way, or how did it come about?
No, it's something that has formed organically. And I used to be the sort of writer that would just start writing and see where the story went. And I still try and do that as much as I can, but I just do that in the structuring stage as opposed to the actual writing stage. But that is how I used to write. And what it sort of led to in my case was very long drafts that had sort of quite sparky dialogue, if I do say so myself, but a very meandering plot. Because you're sort of, and what I have now adopted, which is this much more structured approach. The main thing it does, more than anything, is it saves drafts. And that has been a real shift. And so to use my fantasy books as an example, we really want each book to feel, it is of course part of the series, but we want it to feel individual in a way, so that the first book, the structure is a quest, and the second book is a much more sort of mystery whodunit structure. And that sort of form of storytelling requires a very different structure to a quest. And so that was much more planned out in terms of introducing your new characters and introducing the elements of the mystery, and so all those sorts of things massively helped. And I think had I been like I used to write, which was sort of finding the plot along the way, I think all those clues that I know I have to plant and all those interactions and red herrings and misdirection are harder to do. So I think maybe some story structures lend themselves a bit more to that organic way of storytelling, and the quests certainly do, because you can almost delight yourself in what you find along the way. But for me, I found the more, especially with crime and thrillers, like with a TV show, crime thriller that I'm working on at the moment, that was very, very structured, because I knew I've got so much to do in terms of, I mean, TV requires so much story as it is, but in terms of those clues and misdirections, I thought I need to know where they are ahead of the characters, and it's a lot harder if you're both finding them at the same time.
Yeah. So, Ollie, the last couple of questions that we ask all of our guests are, what were you doing during your teenage years that turned out to be helpful for what you do now? And what advice would you give to that teenage version of you?
Very good questions. What was I? The thing I was doing.
Were you typing away on creating stories from an early age? Or?
I suppose I was, to a degree. The thing I was doing is I used to go to the cinema a lot, and I used to. There's something, and I used to listen. Crucially, I used to listen to a lot of music. Music is by far and away the thing that helps me most in my writing. And I will have different playlists for certain stories, and I'll have different songs for different scenes. And to keep using my fantasy book as an example, my I dare say he's like my artist of the decade is John Powell, because he wrote the How to Train Your Dragon score, and that's a real touch point for this book. And I used to listen to certain songs over and over again, and especially and this is probably a bit too granular, but like certain seconds in, when a certain moment was starting to get, that sort of feeling there is what I'm trying to capture. So I would say music, probably. I still do listen to a lot of music. I listen to a lot of film scores. And the other thing that I listen a lot to, I don't know, maybe lots of people do this, is I listen to trailers. I don't necessarily watch them, but I will listen to them. And I think that they tend to have Hobbit trailer, for example, Unexpected Journey. I used to listen to a lot, because there's a lot of, in that, there's a sort of step up of the world with the sort of traditional Shire music that we used to, and then there's the thing about the Lonely Mountain, and that sort of epic sense of a quest that we have to go and do, and we have to go and slay a dragon, I find very sort of inspiring when I'm writing a quest structure. So I would say the thing I was doing at my teenagers was just listening to a lot of music, but especially around film scores or around trailers or around that sort of stuff. And the advice I would give, I think, is strangely is advice I was told, but I didn't really appreciate at the time, is just to keep writing. And it was that thing of, I remember when I told someone very early on, I think I'm going to be a writer. They said, well, just so you know, it is a lot of rejection. And I was like, I think I'll be okay. I was unprepared for the level of rejection that is in being a writer.
Yeah.
And I think it's a really helpful thing in many ways to have been told that at that point. But the thing that advice I was given was just to keep writing. And whatever it is, whether it's books or radio plays or TV shows or films, I think everything you write sharpens your ability, and it sharpens your instincts, and it sharpens your way of forming characters and the way you can have characters interact and you can develop their story arc. So that, for me, that was always the thing. And I say that someone who is with so many scripts, particularly scripts where I thought, this is the one, this is absolutely the thing. And for whatever reason, it hasn't been.
Yeah.
And I think always then finding excitement in a new project and going, oh, actually, no, this is the thing, is the very aspect of being a writer that has kept me going, because I love the process of writing. And so just doing it as much as I can, as advice to do as much as anyone can. And also the other thing I would say as well that is really beneficial, and I was asked this as part of my book, I go to lots of schools and do talks about fantasy and story structure. And one of the questions I was asked recently is, what do I need to do to be a writer? And I said, actually, you just need to write. There's no qualification in the sense of like, once you have it, you will then, your script take on a certain ability. You just need to write and keep writing. And that's the thing that makes you a writer. It's like the advice Simon Steve has always said is that writing is a verb and you have to write to do it. And I think that is a really good way of thinking about it, is that a writer just has to write and your stories will improve. Sometimes, in my case, stay, but in your case, it might be a lot quicker, but you will just find your way of making stories, and it only happens through putting pen to paper.
Ollie, thank you so much for your time. This has been really wonderful.
Thank you, Ollie.
To gain this knowledge and yeah, share it with our audience. So thank you.
Thank you.
Did you write any novels when you were younger, Ellen?
Yes, I wrote quite a lot. I was quite a budding novelist when I was younger.
Oh, very nice.
I think my first ever novel was like, it was A4 paper like stapled together at the like long edges. I think it was like about a butterfly, but there was also a tent involved. But then I got sort of into more hardcore themes, and I wrote a very long book that was called Two Mums, Two Dads, and a Whole Lot of Lies. Which involved, I think, there was sort of like the parents were in multiple relationships. It was crazy. But it was kind of one of those, there was also like, I think like an adopted child in there. It was like, it was exploring a lot of themes. It was definitely, like Ollie was saying, a lot on the page. Yeah. And I don't think it did get a second draft. But if it had, it would have been interesting to know what the centre of the story was about, because I don't think it had that. But yeah. What about you?
Cool. Yeah, I started writing some fantasy novels, but I had a plan for like a whole trilogy. And inevitably, I think I made it 3 chapters in. And then I think I just focused on screenplays, which I found were much quicker and easier to write.
Yeah.
And I felt like that was my medium.
I've never really found that screenwriting is actually my medium. I think when I do write, it is usually in prose form, and that is the form I sort of connect with more as a writer. But as kind of like a viewer or an editor, I find the screenplay format more intriguing. I don't know. Still figuring that out.
No, for sure. But I think what's amazing, and which is what was really cool hearing about from Ollie, is just how much crossover there is. It's a different presentation, but ultimately it's still story, it's still character, it's still world building, and all those.
No, I completely agree. And having what he described as the spine of a story is applicable to both screen and page. And perhaps in a book you have more freedom to kind of go a little bit wider, but you still always need to come back to that spine, and you always need to have that.
Yeah. No, 100%. You know, it's still structure. I think sometimes novels can be slightly looser in the structure form, but certainly like young adult novels have that sort of clear backbone, I think, and you get a lot of like hero's journeys. I know we spoke about this one being like there being like a central mission in his book to retrieve something. I forgot what the name is for that type of story. I always want to call it a fetch quest, but that's a video game term. Is it called the Golden Fleece or something?
I know what you mean, but I can't remember it.
Golden Fleece novels, Golden Fleece stories, maybe. But yeah, definitely hero's journeys. And obviously a lot of things about showing and not telling still apply, no matter.
Yeah, and I thought it was really interesting what Ollie was talking about with perspective, and how the novel is from the perspective of the best friend of the hero, and how that is also applicable to screenwriting, of like whose perspective you tell the story from, or where you kind of put the story, how that affects the audience, how that affects the story you're telling.
Yeah, 100%. We have a question, Ellen. This question is from Sam, who's 14. Sam says, I know you guys recommend making short films before making a feature. Does the same thing apply to books as well? Would you recommend writing a short story before writing a full book? Ooh, that's a good question. I mean, I like what Ollie was saying about just writing and just making sure that no matter what, you keep writing. And doing that every day, I think, can be good. Obviously, a story that's finished will be effective. And there are, I think, young people's like book competitions that you can enter, or like story competitions. And although sometimes those are like 500 words or 1,000 words, and there's like a brief, so you could respond to those. But yeah, I think when you're younger, it's harder to get. You can self-publish a short film, and I guess you can self-publish a short story, but who's going to read it? I don't think there's an equivalent for YouTube for short stories. So I think, to me, the ultimate goal is just to keep writing, to keep improving the skill set, so that when you're ready, you'll be good enough to write something that could get published, is my instinct.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's about training the writer's muscle, and just writing. I mean, if you're writing and you're like, oh, I just want to keep writing this until it turns into a novel, that's great. But then also one day, if you're like, oh, I don't have much to give to this novel, or like, I don't this idea, I don't have any inspiration for that today, picking up the pen or the laptop and writing something else, and just making sure you're keeping writing, like Ollie said. Yeah, 100%.
Well, guys, don't forget to send your question to podcast@youngfilmacademy.co.uk. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to Ollie. It's been a real treat. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. See you next time. Bye.
See you next time. Bye.